What if the solution to one of the world's biggest problems is simpler than we think? Christine believes it is.
Welcome to She Talks Business. In this episode, we have Christine Manson, a sociopreneur who is leading a revolution in the water industry, creating Indonesia's first 100% natural, locally made water purifier to provide safe drinking water to 1 million Indonesian families. Let's dive into her playbook on aligning profit with purpose.
If I'd probably thought too much about it when I started the business, there's no way I would have done it. We were already working on R&D on the filters. And the world shut down. I found this one document that had, here are all the variables involved in making a filter. And there was like 130 of them. And it was this map of all the things that could go wrong. And I was like, what am I doing? You have this cool, beautiful, funky product in your home that was made from someone else's trash.
So if it's that simple to make, what's stopping others? Christine, I have lots of questions for you, but I'm going to start with a simple one. What's your mission today?
Oof, I have so many missions, but I think where I've landed is safe drinking water for everyone.
And why is that important?
Because it's a basic human right, declared by all of the multinational organizations. The fact that in order to survive, everything needs water. And it's essential for well-being, our livelihood, and the planet. So for me, it's a really big mission, but I think it's achievable.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. I'm going to talk more about that. But before we dive into that, I want to know, you have a background in medical geography.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny. I studied geography for my undergraduate, and I knew I wanted to travel. So that was the impetus for that. But as I started traveling, I was trying to find sort of the common denominator. Like, what kind of career could I have where I just travel? Like, travel agent wasn't really it. But I just felt myself drawn to kind of the human impact within human communities, but also on the planet. And so at that time, I studied sustainable development. And then I went on to study medical geography. And in lieu of studying public health formally, or physical geography formally, what I looked at are things like people's impact on the planet. So, and that can mean anything from human migrations, refugee, right? It can mean women's role in a community, in the place that they live, which is different depending on where you go.
Right.
And so it's really this human aspect of the world.
Amazing.
Yeah.
When we think about solving the world's biggest problems, usually we think about complex solutions. We think about innovation as, disrupting the space. But I think you took something really simple and solved a problem. So tell us more about TerraWater and what you do.
It's funny you say that, because I think that's still the case. So much money is put into complex solutions. And most of the time they don't work. And a lot of that is because we're taking out the human and the nature aspect of it. Yeah. And one of the things I'm seeing a lot in the space is nature-based solutions. Regenerative agriculture, we know, is now yielding more crops than chemical fertilizers. And so I think Terra, for me, it was an opportunity to take an existing technology, a technology that's literally mimicking the Earth's natural processes for cleaning water, and turn that into a business. Why reinvent the wheel? There are things that keep businesses exciting and innovative, but the technology doesn't have to be that thing. You can find other creative ways of doing that.
And can you tell me a little bit more about that technology? What is that solution? What is that technology? How does it work?
So ceramic water filters were invented about 40 years ago in Guatemala by a scientist who felt like safe drinking water should be accessible to everyone, but also that you could make these filters anywhere you could find clay. It was invented during a disaster, so there was plenty of water falling from the sky in a hurricane, but you couldn't drink it. It wasn't potable. And if you know anything about humanitarian assistance, which was my previous career, then you know that disaster relief programs ship in bottles of plastic water. So then you start looking at problems within problems. And so he invented this technology, and the idea is it takes 3 natural materials you can find almost anywhere: clay, silver nanoparticles, and activated carbon. We use the red clay, so we can find that everywhere in Indonesia. We fire a pot, so it literally looks like a garden pot, really simple solution. And when we put it into the kiln, we've manufactured that in such a way that when the kiln is firing the pot, microscopic pores are opened up because the materials inside start to burn out. And the pores are actually smaller than the bacteria and viruses being poured through it.
Wow.
So they get caught in the microscopic pores of the filter, and then they run through a layer of activated carbon and silver nanoparticles. So everything that goes into the bottom is 100% safe to drink. Really, really simple. And the pot can be modified to fit in any receptacle that is the right size. So as long as it's food grade, you can put that pot into a bucket, which we've done. You could make a beautiful container out of ceramic, which we've done. One thing I aspire to do, I mentioned that the technology doesn't have to be complicated, but you can innovate on the business. And one of the things we want to do is really come up with cool materials that are maybe recycled or upcycled, that we could put the filters in, so that we're not always reliant on ceramic or plastic, or right now we're using steel and enamel. So I feel like the future of kind of our R&D is really getting into the materials science space and finding out who's doing what in terms of upcycled materials that are already existing and we can mold into a receptacle. And then you have this cool, beautiful, funky product in your home that was made from someone else's trash, which sounds terrible, but trust me.
It sounds amazing, actually.
You should be able to drink out of it. That's the idea.
But so if it's that simple to make, what's stopping others or your competitors from doing the same thing? Why should I not be using other water filters? How is it better? Is it cheaper? Tell me more.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. When I was researching the technology, I thought the same thing. Why don't we see this everywhere? Natural materials found almost anywhere in the world. It's solving a problem. And it turns out that the filters are really hard to make.
Right.
So we launched during the pandemic and spent nearly a year figuring out how to make the filters. And so I think that's why you don't see these all the time. We believe there's about 20 filter factories in the world making these. I only know about 5 or 6 of them, most of them being run as a foundation as opposed to a social enterprise like Terra. And so once we got the filters right, and again, we're using natural materials, so there's a lot of variables that can go wrong. Once we got the recipe right and we started making filters, to me, it opened up this incredible opportunity for a market in Indonesia, where Indonesians have been taught that they cannot drink from the tap. They have to buy plastic water bottles.
Yeah.
Indonesians at the base of the pyramid who don't have access to water and are living on like less than $1 a day, many of them know that they have to boil their water, but others don't. And so what we've created with the ceramic filters is a product that meets the needs of those families that were boiling or weren't boiling and drinking the water directly, all the way to the upper echelons of celebrities in Jakarta. Because again, we're using cool, innovative materials. We're using a nature-based solution that a lot of people are motivated by because it doesn't use any plastic. It literally eliminates the need for plastic water bottles entirely. It filters out microplastics, which a lot of people are also motivated by, that health factor. So it has this incredible like environmental pull, but also those families know we're supporting families that don't have access to water, so bottom of the pyramid. And we do have a lot of clients both in the sort of B2B and B2C sectors that are motivated by our social mission, and that's why they buy products. So it's not, in terms of filtering, it's not the world's best water filter, but we don't need the world's best water filter. We need something that takes out the stuff that makes us sick. Our competitors in Indonesia before Terra were really big box water filtration solutions that were very expensive, anywhere from hundreds to thousands of dollars. It required like in-home installations, lots of filter changes, and tons of maintenance. Most families can't afford that. So again, they're buying it in plastic or they're cooking it. So we've really met a market need here in Indonesia, and we're the second company in the whole country who's built a countertop water filter. We have a lovely competitor that works in the safe water space, and they work kind of in the mid and bottom of the pyramid range. And so we're literally the first to market for a high-end water filter that looks good in your kitchen, that's at a price point nearly everyone can afford.
That's also amazing. I can think of so many things to talk about. I'm struggling to structure some of those questions in my head and like in what sequence I want to ask all of them. I also want to know more about the production process itself, because you mentioned that that's what's keeping your competitors out. Would you be okay telling us a little bit more about what does that look like, building the product itself? So from like sourcing the material to like production, what is the process like?
To give you an example, clay is dirt, right? So there's lots of dirt out there, but it's not all the right kind of dirt. So these natural materials have their own variability. And on any given day, we get a vein of clay that has too much soil in it. We call it really loamy, like it's spongy. So then if we try to make a filter with it, it would just kind of fall apart. And then we find some that doesn't have enough elasticity or plasticity. So then if we fired a filter, it would break. So there's a lot of testing we have to do on the natural materials to get the right type of material. And then the testing happens before it comes to the factory, and then it happens at the factory.
Right.
So we have to build in that protocol into our production so that it's ongoing. And that's true for all of our materials. And so it also, when you look at the nature of ceramics, which is a several thousand-year-old industry around the world, the failure rate in ceramics, depending on what you're making, is like 30 to 50%. Like even on the plates and cups that you buy from a store. And that's baked into margins. So ceramics companies know that ceramics is risky. Now that said, you can make something beautiful and sell it for a lot of money, and it costs you $2 to make. In the case of our filters, they cost almost nothing because of the raw materials. And those costs of goods sold will continue to go down as our volume goes up. And then we'll be able to offer even more subsidized products to bottom of the pyramid. So when I was studying the filter technology, and I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to make these? Like, I have to build these new machines, I have to factory, I got to find clay. I found this one document that had, here are all the variables involved in making a filter. And there was like 130 of them. And it was this map of all the things that could go wrong. And I was like, what am I doing? So it's a constant process. And I'm lucky that I have an amazing team who is really focused on quality control. And again, we've built that testing protocol into our methodology. And so it's ongoing, so we're never falling behind. But it makes it difficult to scale. And that is a real challenge. I was going to
ask, how does that work then? Because that's tough.
It's totally tough. Our partners in the industry are making, the biggest filter companies out there are making about 750,000 filters a year. That seems to be the maximum capacity based on where we are after 40 years in this technology. Now that said, I don't know that any of them have really spent funds on R&D on the machine side of things, right? Or in building in efficiencies. There's a few here and there. So there's a few different industries we're looking at now to see, can we use some of their techniques to increase our pass rate, for example, or to fire the filters quicker. Right now, Terra we spend anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks waiting for a pot to dry just before we filter it. But there's drying rooms out there that like tile companies use, for example. So scaling is going to be difficult for us, but what we're planning here in Indonesia is a distributed production model where we then have filter factories, many different filter factories in the area where they're serving.
So one of the things which initially my understanding was that you took something that people were already familiar with and introduced it into the market. So there might not have been a lot of challenges in terms of adoption and in terms of changing consumer behavior. But it seems like you mentioned one that, Indonesians are told not to use tap water, so on and so forth. So I'm assuming there must have been a lot of challenges in terms of explaining to people why they need this, how this works. And so from a business perspective, from a consumer or a customer acquisition perspective, it must have been very different. So I think there's two parts to the question. One is, how do you convince people that this is important or needed or will solve a problem? And two, how do you get to them and find them and then also get them to buy from you or use your product?
Yeah, it's funny you say, that introducing the product. I think one of the things that if I'd probably thought too much about it when I started the business, there's no way I would have done it. I would have been like, what do I think I'm doing? Moving to Indonesia, 275 million people, 10% of those without access to water. And it was new product, new market. Nothing like this existed in the country. But I did tons of research, tons and tons of market research. I looked at the commercial market. I looked at the social market. And it was just clear that a product like this could take off here. Part of that is the cultural appropriateness of clay. So if you go into the Indonesian villages, they call it a kandi, but it's basically a terracotta pot. And for centuries, they would take the groundwater, they put it in the pot, the dirty stuff would float to the bottom, and they drink off the top. But back then, we didn't have overpopulation, and we didn't have animals in our kitchen, and we had more space. And so we didn't have latrines next to our water source. So it was probably pretty clean water in the first place. So we have had to introduce this idea of taking the water from the source and putting it in the pot. What's funny is they look at the filter and they're like, oh, of course, we've been drinking out of these for thousands of years. But the behavior change comes. The education for us has been really, yes, you can use your tap water, or you can use rainwater, or you can use the groundwater, or maybe there's a pond or a stream nearby that's relatively clean, and you can put that through it. It absolutely blows their mind. And so that's been a lot of work, is that behavior change, and it's ongoing. We're talking about Terra's goals are really to start operating on every single island in Indonesia. Right now, about 80% of our operations in Bali, 20% in Jakarta, which is a huge market, 10 million families by itself. And so what we're looking at is how do we start to pivot the conversation a little bit from sort of that early adopter market into our primary market. And it was really nice to be able to start in a place like Bali. And that was strategic for me because, again, new product, new market. I needed an open-minded population who said, okay, this is weird, but I'm willing to try it. And then now we have 4.5 years proof of concept. And we're seeing 20% organic traction in our Indonesian market. Wow. So that's the primary market. And so right now, we'll start spending a lot of our efforts looking at what motivates them, what drives them to purchase products like this. And what's been so interesting about this product, and honestly almost made it more work, is I feel like when you study traditional business, it's like find your market segment, develop a business plan that targets that segment. Like if you have a high-end backpack or something. The problem with my filter, it's a good problem to have, is that it's serving people with plenty of money and people with no money and everybody in between. So it's really hard for us to kind of dive into individual market segments and say, okay, how do we sell to like the top market in Jakarta, but then also ensure that we're serving that bottom of the pyramid population that we know is driving our mission. Yeah. And so we have like 4 different business models, and right now we're doing our best to execute on them all. And I think we're doing that quite effectively by coming across as an aspirational company, as a lifestyle brand, as not looking at ourselves like our partners in the industry who only work with foundations, but as a home goods company. And our message is really, we have a water filter for everyone. And so I think that really resonates. Like, I deserve this. Even if I make less than $1 a day, I deserve the same product. And it is the same product. We give everyone the exact same filter as the people who paid $1,000 for their filter. And we have auctioned some for $1,000. It's exactly the same filter.
Exciting. That's interesting.
Yes.
And you've, I think, in different ways sort of touched upon it, but tell me more about how are you making money? What's the business model?
So we have decided to be a social enterprise. I worked in the nonprofit sector most of my career, and chasing money, chasing donations. Case in point, when I worked at the American Red Cross, I was on the operations team, which means I'm like driving around trucks all day and responding to disasters. But then we had an entire department of attractive women, and all they did was fundraise. I got to spend the money; they had to pull in the money. And I just said, I don't want to chase money. Like, if I build a business, it's going to be financially sustainable business so that we can commit to the social mission. But I think I just got really lucky with this filter technology again, because I've been able to flip the script. So we are a for-profit company with a really strong social mission. We have a foundation so that if we want to fundraise, or if we find that there are partners who want to donate or work specifically with a foundation, we have that. Sometimes there's grants out there that are not for for-profit businesses, but instead for foundations. So we can keep that arm of the business going. We do all of our the water sanitation and hygiene training through the foundation. Some of our CSR partners prefer to work with the for-profit business as opposed to the foundation, but anyway, we've got options. And so before we had those partnerships, we were supporting the foundation from day one. We launched during COVID, and my idea for the business was not to start with the social model. Again, new technology, new market. If we had started with a social model, people would never buy our high-end filters because they'd say, no, these are filters for poor people, right? So it was really risky, but we launched straight into action, providing hand washing stations, doing our wash trainings, and giving out filters during COVID. But we were also quietly working at the factory on all of our high-end models, because once we started to gain that traction and reputation in our name, we wanted to have a product ready to go.
Wow. Amazing. How was COVID like? Because I think you started right before COVID, and then COVID happened. What went on there?
I moved here in 2018. And so it took about a year to get all the paperwork done in Indonesia, find a factory location, build our machines. And so we spent that whole year doing that. So then the end of 2019, early 2020, we were already working on R&D on the filters. And the world shut down. And we didn't know if we'd have a market for our product. We didn't even know if we were going to find all the materials we needed to finish our R&D and create an MVP. But we worked on it anyway. We just kept working on it, and we actually, we built the business. It was so nice and quiet, we built the business. But the research that I had done for Indonesia wasn't on the tourism market in the first place. It was on the domestic market. It was on the Indonesians and expats living here. So I knew I still had a market that was in place. Now, whether or not they had disposable income was a different question. So it was actually a really great time for us to build the business, to build the product. And I think we got a little leeway in the beginning too. Your MVP is never your best product, right? It's like, you're like, okay, is this working? It needs to work, but it's not pretty. And so we conducted lots of little market tests. We actually put our products into Balinese villages when we were donating filters. And we said, look, use this product instead of what we were doing. And we're going to come in every single week and we're going to ask you a bunch of questions. And at the end of that month, we'll take back the filters and we'll have all your results and we'll thank you for your time. I was fully prepared to be like, oh my gosh, I've just built a factory and machines and spent all this money and time on R&D, and now I'm gonna have to go back to America and get a job. But 100% of these families continued using their filters and paid for them. At that time, the average Balinese family was making about $125 a month. Family income in the middle of COVID. And they still found the money to buy this product because it had that much value for them. They didn't have to boil their water anymore. It tasted good. It was aspirational enough. We did end up working on some stickers and branding. But we asked them all those questions too. So it was such an incredible opportunity for us to see, is this going to work? At a time when, again, people didn't have disposable income. And now that people have money again, we've been able to play with our things like our pricing model.
Right. How big do you think the impact can be over, let's say, the next 2, 5, whatever number of years? How big is the scale of impact that you see you can make?
It's interesting. As I said before, the filters aren't for everyone. There's some people who just may never trust it. It's a nature-based solution, and that's okay. Especially in COVID when Jakartans were coming around with their like UV sprays. I don't know if you ever saw those, but like everything they touched was just like, okay. So they're most comfortable cracking open a plastic water bottle, right? But our receptiveness has been good. And what I'm really looking at, so the water filter market in Indonesia is growing 13% a year. It's like a $415 million market right now. So there's tons of purchasing potential. When I look at Indonesia's geography, like 70% of the population is in the West. It's Java and Sumatra. And then in the East, it's really lightly populated, but there's huge social needs. So with an archipelago of 17,000 islands, I think 3/4 of them are populated. We're looking at what looks like our economic pyramid copy-pasted throughout the country. Can we put a filter factory on all of those islands or several filter factories and really truly employ a circular economy business model where we're using natural materials on that island, local labor, we're making a product for the people in that place, whether they have lots of money or little bits of money, one may be subsidizing the other, and solving social and environmental issues exactly where the filters are being made. And so the market potential is great. And I think I'm really excited because Indonesia is also so incredibly diverse geographically and culturally. There's like, I don't even know what to quote. I think there's like 100 indigenous languages or more here, right? So then you start to think, wow, like every time we copy paste this business model, we get to rework the message, the branding, the colors, the cool, innovative container designs. We did a project with the Gojek Foundation from 2022 to 2023, and it was a pilot in Makassar, Sulawesi, which is actually on the high need for safe drinking water based on United Nations and USAID statistics. And so it was a really incredible product pilot for us to bring the product in, but also do our wash training. And so we throw the team in there, we're like doing all of our usual stuff, and we put the filters out, little market test, just like we did in Bali. And people are like, oh no, like the colors are wrong, the branding's wrong. Like we like the pot, but can we put it in something else? So we had to rework the whole branding just for that market. They wanted fire red and they wanted like nautical themes. And we did that. And again, we had this incredible receptiveness to the product. And so to me, that's driving my, like, I guess, personal ambition. Obviously, there's the social mission and there's all the business challenges. But I think what drives me personally is that creativity and innovation that probably for the next 20 plus years, because it's going to take that long to even touch the market here, we're always going to be developing something new and pivoting and adapting and innovating in terms of materials and marketing and branding. Yeah. So it's very exciting.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think you've talked about so many things where I was thinking, how did you learn all this? Like, how do you know all this? You moved to a country which is not your home country, so not your home ground. You went into a space that you didn't know much about. You weren't building products before this. And then you've mentioned all these things about like material sciences and like consumer behavior and like all of things. And then you also mentioned how difficult it is to build the product. How does one learn all this?
Trial and error. It's funny. I teach a class now here in Bali. It's Dutch and Balinese students, and it's a class on entrepreneurship. And I think what's different about young people now versus when I studied is everyone's pushing young people to be entrepreneurs, and so they come out of school with this incredible confidence. I'll just start my own company, but it's hard. And so one of the things that I reiterate to them is that it's not easy. 90% of startups fail worldwide. And it takes two things to keep it going, to make a business successful. One is you can't run out of money, because that you'd be done. And two, you can't give up. And so I think it takes a lot of like personal integrity to just be confident enough that you can do it without knowing everything, and know that some things can be learned, leveraging those strengths or interests, but also recognizing where maybe you're not good at something or it's a distinct weakness, and finding people to support you where you have those. And so I'm just an opportunist in that way, where I can see a problem and I can plug myself into the places where I think I can support, and then find people to do the rest. It definitely takes a certain kind of person to be able to have the vision and the operations. Not everybody can do that. I don't think having both of those is essential, but I think if you're an entrepreneur, you have to have the vision. You don't have to do the operations, but you better know how to manage people who can do the operations. So much of what I've learned has been also partly because I had a career before this. And I think that's the other mistake young people are making, is they graduate from university, or they don't even go to university, which is okay, but they just want to start their business right away. But if you don't have those life skills, if you haven't worked or built something for another business, you haven't learned how to do that. Yeah. You haven't been pushed. You haven't had a performance review to see how you interact. You haven't had to manage anybody. And so I think that lends a lot to my experience. And the rest is just saying, I just need to figure this out. I need to build a business plan. And I get made fun of all the time. Like, my students are like, you wrote a business plan? Because they're having to write one for their course. I'm like, and they were like, who did you write it for? I'm like, myself. Like, I wrote a 32-page business plan for myself before I started this business, because I was like, how am I going to roll this out? And that helped me kind of identify, okay, these are these gaps in knowledge, or these are these gaps in skills. Yeah. So there's no such thing as under or over planning. In fact, I think most people under plan, and that's where they start running out of money, for example. Yeah. So just plan and study. And I think if it's an exhausting career path, but it's so fulfilling because you're always learning.
True. You know what's interesting about this conversation is that usually I have a lot to say. But today I have a lot to ask. Which is very weird for me. It's very unlike me. So you mentioned how difficult it is to run a business. But I think to run a social enterprise, I personally think is much, much more difficult. And I think one of the challenges is balancing that social side as well as making money. And then whether it's from an ethical perspective or a financial perspective, how do you balance that?
The numbers have to work out. So you can't run out of money. And I think if you have a good business model, and I think there's lots of ways to do that. It's not a single copy paste. Patagonia, who you've probably heard of, is a really aspirational company that makes really expensive backpacks and clothing. They have a program they call 1% for the Planet, where they made a commitment early on that they would donate 1% of all their profits to their environmental activities. But they also did little things in the company, like they had a really great work-life balance that they offered to their employees. They did things like profit sharing for their employees who stuck around. It's a bit of a sweat equity. Hey, if you help us build this, then you're in. Yeah. So there's lots of different ways it can be done while keeping an eye on the bottom line and ensuring that, you're creating a quality product, you're creating a quality brand. You can't slack on those things. You can kind of slack on the social stuff because nobody's holding you accountable for that most of the time. Unfortunately, you need your ROI. You've got to be able to pay the bills. But I think, to your point, it is challenging to say, yes, but that's also a commitment. And how do we pay for it? And sometimes that's creative. So one thing we do at Terra is if we have donations coming through, we support our own social programs. Before we had the foundation, we did it ourselves. We were actually taking 10% of all profit and putting it into social programs during COVID. So we weren't profitable during COVID, but if we paid the bills, it was that 10% of extra revenue, we would donate filters and we would go donate our own wash. Now we do things like we work with CSR partners. Some of them are really big, like giant multinational tobacco companies. And they're paying for a robust program where we go train their staff. We capacitate their farmers in the filter technology. We provide filters, but they pay for that, right? So that gets built into the business model. And so there are really creative ways to make sure that you're always doing the mission, but still keeping an eye on the bottom line.
How important do you think the mission is in terms of finding good people who work with you? Do you think it makes it easier or harder?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I find is that most people on our team are motivated by our social mission. But we don't see it every day. Day-to-day stuff gets really boring. It's like processing sales and like programming and writing SOPs. But when we do have village trips, we pull in everyone from our team. So even like the production team who's making the filters, I make them go into the village and do interviews with families so they can see it and they can be a part of it. So many of our staff have been with us since the beginning. And I think that is a part of why they're there. Now, that said, you've alluded to the fact that finding key staff is difficult, and it really is. Some companies believe in like financial incentives. We can't do that as a social enterprise because we're committing to our social mission. We're also sort of in that startup growth phase where, we can't throw money at like a seasoned general manager. We're having to scale gradually. One of the things that I really aspire to is creating a culture of innovation and creativity and entrepreneurship. And I think if we can scale to a big badass company and still maintain that sort of startup vibe where everyone puts on a different hat that day and we have to work as a team and we're solving problems, and there's breakout groups who are thinking about innovative ways to either conduct a marketing pilot or something, you can keep that culture alive. And I think people are innately incentivized by being a part of something. And so maybe it's the mission, or maybe it's in growing a company and keeping it fresh and exciting. So those are sort of the two angles that I aspire to do at Terra.
I feel like the wide-eyed child who's so curious about what you're doing and how you're doing it.
It's a bit technical, but
yeah. But my understanding is that the impact that you're making with the work that you're doing is not just limited to access to safe water. So what are the other, what can I call them? How are you measuring impact in other terms? What are the other data points that you have in terms of, because you also mentioned there's a problem within a problem. And so you're technically solving for those problems as well.
Right.
So it's not just how many people get to have safe drinking water. It's a lot more than that.
It is. I've kind of broken it up into 3 different buckets: economic, environmental, and social. And I've applied that to all of our market segments, whether it be the impact bottom of the pyramid customers, or whether it be the people in Jakarta who have more money than they need and buy a product because it's pretty. So the economic for most families is cost savings. That tends to be one of our biggest market motivators, is if you buy a Terra filter, even if you buy one of the more expensive ones, you've paid for water basically in 3 months for 2 years. You have 2 years of water and you've paid for it in 3 months.
Wow.
For the more expensive products, it's about 6 months. So you have a year and a half of free water. So it pays for itself. So that's a huge one. And then that even actually applies to the bottom of the pyramid, because we have studies that show that women in Jakarta are spending as much as $11 a month on firewood to boil water. They'd pay for a filter in 3 months.
Wow.
So economic is a really big one. And we find that even people with money are incentivized by a good deal, right? Environmental is huge because we're moving microplastics, or moving plastic from the environment, eliminating it at its source. I mentioned biomass. So people that are using wood to boil their water no longer are doing that. So deforestation is reduced. We've calculated that one filter in place of boiling water with wood eliminates 2.06 tons of CO2 for every 2 years that filter's in use. So that's huge, right? In 10 years, that's like 50,000 cars or something. And then you don't have to see plastic water bottles. We're using nature-based solutions and, sustainable supply chains with natural materials. So the environmental is huge. And then finally, the social is everything from the design. So people love the cool containers, the fact that we're using beautiful ceramics and fun colors and enamel. The material science part might get really exciting someday. So having something in their kitchen that's not a big plastic water bottle and instead a beautiful ceramic vessel that's making clean water is definitely a market motivator. But also on the social side are things like health. So the elimination of diarrheal diseases in children. In Indonesia, it's been reported that it's anywhere from 5 to 10% of all children under 5 are dying of diarrhea. These are really hard statistics to find because as a bottom-up governance system in Indonesia, there's a lot of underreporting. People are very proud here. They don't want to tell you what their problems are, but now we're seeing in these villages that this is a real issue. We're also looking at things like respiratory disease in women. So when they're boiling with that firewood, they're often doing it in an enclosed space because if you let air in, the fire goes out of control. So you have to close in the space. So women are getting respiratory disease from burning with firewood. So we're trying to eliminate that as well. So there's a huge market motivator in our high-end filter consumers to support these types of social issues as well, right? And so they kind of play on each other, these economic, environmental, and social. In terms of impact, the things that we look for, so the way we conduct our impact tracking is when we go to those bottom of pyramid customers, we do a baseline and an inline survey with every family. And what we want to know is their water journey. We start with everything from like, where do you get your water from? Do you have to go get it? Does it come from the ground? Like, where is it in the home? What do you boil it or do you drink it directly? What do you boil it with, right? So that's when we know if they're using gas or firewood. Maybe they drink it directly, which is even worse and scarier. And then we do an inline survey anywhere from 30 to 60 days after filters are being used. And we ask the same questions. Where's your water coming from? How many gallons are you buying, which is the big water tanks, or how much water are you boiling? Or how much are you hydrating? So that's a huge one. We start to see hydration go up. And we know that like dehydration in children in schools, especially public schools in Indonesia that don't provide safe drinking water, dehydration causes kids to have erratic behavior. It's been proven that their behavior is worse when they don't have enough water. So hydration is huge. And we're working with a lot of farmers. They're out in the fields working all day with like a half a liter of water. So those are the major impact categories we're looking at. We're looking at things like health due to things like hydration, minimization of diarrheal diseases, respiratory diseases, but we're also looking at things like time. So on the economic side, women are predominantly responsible for water worldwide. They can spend up to 4 hours a day just on water, going to get it, preparing the firewood, cooking it, and that could be because they have a big family. It could be because they're making water for all of those farmers. And so we know based on 40 years of research that when women have time back, they do really amazing things. They get jobs themselves. they find economic opportunities to pull in revenue or income for their family. They can better support their kids. Their kids are healthier and are going to school. So these are the types of impact parameters that we're looking at, which are really quantitative. So funny enough, just this morning I was reading an article by a really big group called Charity Water. They're one of the biggest nonprofit water organizations, very well known. And the article this morning was about how they're starting to look at qualitative impact categories. And they're talking to women and they're asking them questions like, how does this make you feel? And women are saying things like, I'm angry. Like, I'm angry when I have to spend this much time dealing with water. Or I'm ashamed that I have to do this in the first place when I know families who don't, right? Maybe they can afford to buy the bottled water or safe water. And so I think what we don't know are what are the long-term effects of these sort of psychological elements that are going on inside of a woman who is responsible for the health of her home. And so I thought that was really interesting. And apparently they've submitted to have that particular criteria in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, things like shame and anger.
Okay, last question. What is one book or blog or person that's changed your life, and why or how?
I've mentioned this idea that a business can scale and keep this culture of sort of creativity and problem solving and entrepreneurship. And I read a book when I was starting Terra that sort of changed the way that I operate, and it sort of meshed that work-life balance. It's called The Lean Startup. And I'm thinking a lot of people have read it now, but it's based on this lean manufacturing model from Toyota. But the idea is to do things, get them done, test them, and then pivot as necessary. And I think that model has been so instrumental for a startup. If you look at startups nowadays, the advice that's given to you is like, don't build a factory, don't build the machines, do some mock-ups online, try to sell them, get some pre-sales, like 100%, because it's risky to dive into creating a product right away. And so we did a version of that. We asked lots of questions, and we actually brought one over from us and showed it to people. And so the Lean Startup was really probably, of all the business books I've read, and I've had to read them all. That's where I learned everything, is I read all the books. Is the one where I felt like, if I'm also doing that, then it doesn't ever have to be perfect. It's a test. And as long as I know what variables I'm testing, it's short term, I know what decisions I'll make afterwards, I can check that box and I can take some time off. And so that was a game changer for me.
Amazing. Yeah. I had a great time, Christine. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Like I said, this was very different because I just didn't have a lot to say. I had a lot to ask, but it was fun.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here.
If you found this episode interesting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.